Alright guys, Bill here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another spoiler review for a recently released game, and here I'll be talking about my spoiler-filled thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now to give context for this video, I am someone that had not really jumped into the franchise until Remake, to which while I had my qualms with that game, I very much enjoyed that game, to where I then eventually went out to experience the original Final Fantasy VII, which kind of recontextualized my thoughts on the Remake trilogy, to where coming into Rebirth here, I was interested in what they were doing, but wasn't really confident at how they were going to execute what they were trying to do. And now I could say after Rebirth has fully come out, that Rebirth sucks. And it's mind-blowing to me to see all this universal praise for this game, a game that I look at as being a complete disaster. Not just in a Final Fantasy VII perspective or as a sequel to FF7 Remake, which in that I think it is largely lackluster, but even just as a general game. Like, I genuinely do not understand how this game is being well received from the general audience. Like, to me, this is a game filled with bloat and sluggish gameplay with a very vapid open world that feels like it's only there because they decided to follow the trends of modern games, to where it just really takes the original experience that was Final Fantasy VII and ends up butchering it over the course of this game's really extended runtime, to where I will say, if you're expecting a positive review of this game, do not watch this video. I mean, straight up, this is probably one of the most negative experiences I had with a game that I'm actually bothering to do a spoiler review for. I should mention that this video will not just include spoilers for Rebirth, but really the entire Final Fantasy VII series. I will 100% be spoiling major events in the OG, so again, if you have not played the OG, I would not recommend watching this video. Now, straight up gameplay wise, I don't feel like there's even that much to really talk about with this game. Obviously, it's just a improvement upon Final Fantasy VII Remake. The combat is very similar, though with the addition of synergy abilities, which, to be fair, I actually do like in this game. I do like how it connects to this game's focus on your bond with your party members, and again, overall, I think that's a fine addition here. Now, beyond that, again, this game does have an open world, one that actually surprised me at how open it was, where I was very much coming into this game expecting it to be a more linear style open world, kind of more reminiscent to the likes of Final Fantasy 16. For while it is technically an open world, it is one that funnels you through its main campaign with there not being this excessive amount of bloat. But then we get to the game itself, where there's towers that unlock markers on the map, and there's a massive checklist of things to do in the open world, and it's like, why? Why is this a thing in Final Fantasy VII? A game that, for the most part, despite again having a technical open world, it was very linear in how it was designed. And for them to take that design and actually genuinely make an open world game here is pretty insane to me. Not straight up, I did not bother doing a lot of the side activities in this game. I did during the initial grassland section of the game, then realized I really just did not care enough to do more of them, considering how monotonous they ended up being. Though, to be fair, I do hear good things about certain side quests in the game, but really the thing I obviously primarily focused on was the main campaign, which again, they somehow bloated to a ridiculous extreme, where again, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a game that I criticize for being bloated as is. I do feel like it's a game that is way longer than it needs to be. However, at least there, it felt like there was always this focus in what was actually going on in the story. To a while, again, I did feel like sections went on for a bit too long. I never felt like the game was just meandering about. I felt like we always knew what the goal was, where I feel like this game, it does feel like you're just meandering about. I do feel like a lot of that comes from the fact that this is in the middle of the original Final Fantasy VII. It's in a portion of the game where you are just going from location to location, hunting down Sephiroth, and while I feel like that is fine in the middle of a grander game like Final Fantasy VII, when it's the entire game, like in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, it just feels like nothing is happening. Where I just felt like for most of this game, I was thinking, what is the point of any of this? And straight up, the point is that they just want to remake Final Fantasy VII, but doing it in a worse way because the context isn't even as fully set up as the original game. And really, straight up, that is one of the major qualms of the main story of this game. I feel like it's just a mess. It's a story that tries to jumble around so much that ends up including these half-baked plots plot threads from the compilation while also trying to remake moments from the original game, but just not doing it as well because it's surrounded by all these extenuating sequences where I left this game just genuinely being confused at what they were trying to do, with me realizing now that what they're trying to do is actually worse than what I ever expected. Or coming into this game, I expected this to continue on with this pseudo sequel that Final Fantasy VII Remake was, and trying to continue those plot threads, only to realize here that that's not the focus of this game. The focus of this game is again just simply to remake Final Fantasy VII as what you would assume it would have been to begin with, but again just making it worse. And all these plot threads that were set up in Remake just don't lead to anything. For instead of this being a sequel, it instead just feels like this is actually their modern interpretation of Final Fantasy VII, which is bad. But again, I do want to run through the game chapter by chapter to go more in detail on certain things. But anyway, we started off with chapter 1, which is obviously mostly comprised of the Nibelheim flashback, though we do actually start off with a Zack sequence, which again, like now that I've gotten to the end of the game, Zack's role in this game is just even more perplexing, where it simply just feels like he's there for fan service. He's simply just there because some people like Zack, Square Enix seems to love Zack, and they just want to add him to the game, even though it makes no sense for him to be added to the game. And it actually significantly harms the original story being told in the original game through people knowing who Zack is. Yet they're fine with that. Where again, I thought that they were fine with that because they were going to tell a new story with Zack, but we find out by the end of this game that that's not the case. They're just adding him in for fan service. And again, we continue to get these like shorter sequences of Zack's story across this game at very random points in the game, sometimes like mid-chapter, and a lot of them are super short. Really, most of them we saw in the promotional content. And again, it very much just feels like Zack's role in this game was going to be expanded, but then they cut it pretty late into development to where a lot of it just comes off very disjointed. And again, while I don't think the Zack portions of the game are good, I feel like there were good ideas that could have been done with Zack's role in this story, only for them to just simply not do any of them. Where sure, I did spend a lot of this game thinking that this was the afterlife, or maybe that this was the real timeline and the Rebirth timeline was a fake timeline. I had, again, a lot of these like crazy theories that turned out, no, we're just playing it straight. This is just an alternate timeline that now exists because we wanted to add Zack to the game. But again, we do get to the actual Nibelheim flashback, which again, somehow they do worse than the OG. And we add in like dumb conveniences like a lightning strike breaking the bridge instead of it just breaking down because it's old. We have dumb gameplay of using this like vacuum to sweep up the Mako, which it's like, why? And this game is filled with moments like this, of points where you have to do something so slowly for no reason just to bloat out the game. And I think the most damning thing for me here is the fact that you can play as Sephiroth, but Sephiroth just comes off as any other character. Again, the point of Sephiroth's role in the OG game and him being in your party was to show how powerful he is, yet here you play him and he's just slightly better than Cloud. And not to mention the ridiculous moment of you crawling through the fire and we see these like villagers surrounding Sephiroth with guns only for nothing to shoot him as we crawl super slowly, and this entire section is so stupid. Anyway, chapter 2 takes place in Calm, followed by us exploring the grasslands, to where the initial content in Calm was just so perplexing to me in the fact that the game makes it extremely clear right away that Cloud wasn't in Nibelheim, which again is supposed to be this big reveal. Again, the reveal that Cloud's memories are fake and that they were actually Zack's memories, and us finding out who Zack is and later finding out Cloud's role in all this was the main mystery of the original game. And for that to just be essentially leaked right away in this game and then constantly reiterated is bizarre to me, especially now knowing that this is essentially just a remake of Final Fantasy VII. Where again, to me, it's like I knew that these sort of foreshadowing to things earlier in the game were happening in Remake, though my assumption again was that a new story was being told here. And that kind of justified there being those sort of moments, but now knowing that there isn't a new story, at least not that different of one being told here, and it's essentially just a remake with extra bloat, makes this decision here even more questionable. The level of disrespect they put into how the original game was structured and moving up a lot of these bigger reveals that would be happening in part 3 up to very early portions of this game. And we do get this like really strange scene here too of a conversation between Cloud and Tifa, where Tifa confronts Cloud and seems genuinely annoyed and upset at him, which just feels so unlike Tifa. And again, like initially I thought, oh, they're doing something with this. I mean, we literally get the line from Sephiroth saying, you know that I killed her, but who is she? And it very much implied to me that, oh, they're going to be doing something with Tifa, that this is not the real Tifa. But no, it is the real Tifa. And for some reason, she's acting not like Tifa. Where again, one of the greatest aspects of Tifa's character in the original game was how she handled Cloud and how she was always understanding and caring of him. Yet here she just doesn't come off that way. But following this, we obviously get the introduction to the open world, leading to more tedious tasks at Chocobo Bill's farm and meeting his grandson and getting a Chocobo, because we needed to cross the swamps, which were pretty monotonous. And before we leave the farm, we have to do this Chocobo mini game of racing it around the field, and really just straight up, this game has way too many mini games. It feels like it adds so many mini games to replace its lack of substance by bloating its length, by trying to impress you with all these different little games they're at here that the main story does force you to play at least once, despite them not really doing much for the overall experience. I'll say the one addition that I did very much like was Queen's Blood. Strip, I did find a fun game. I did actually play Queen's Blood here and there, and I did feel like if I had more time, it would be a game that I would actually genuinely enjoy playing. Again, in a world where it feels like every single game is trying to create its version of Gwent, I do feel like this is actually probably one of the better ones that I've played. But anyway, Chapter 3 ends up being obviously the Mithril Mines, a section that could have been very short, but in remake trilogy fashion, they decided to bloat it out as much as possible. So this gets us introduced to this trope that this game does in separating our party and making us play as both groups as they do the same tasks to get to the same place. And again, just feels like massive bloat here, where first we see Tifa, Cloud, and Aerith go through the caves, and we have a boss battle against the Turks, only for Barret and Red to get separated, to which then we need to play as Barret and Red as they get out of the caves. And again, it just feels like such a waste of time, especially with the Barret section in particular, just being annoying to play. And we have this like environmental puzzle, pushing this crate around, and it's just so slow. And it's like, who is enjoying this? It genuinely boggles my mind how this is something that people actually developed and thought this was a good idea, to have you pushing a crate to the other side of the room for like a minute. But anyway, we get to Chapter 4, which ends up being the Junon section of the game, where it is here that we do get introduced to Yuffie, who just had a strange role in this game. I mean, Yuffie is a character that straight feels radically different from the OG, and to be fair, I was fine with that. I don't mind them making changes to the OG, as long as it's done well. I do feel like in Intermission, I feel like she had this character development that made me think we were going to get her as this well-formed character coming in this game, but then she's not. She kind of regresses back to this character that just wants materia all the time, even though it doesn't really make sense for her character anymore. And it's seemingly just doing that because that's what she was in the OG. And this is also the first time that we get this hint at Red 13's real voice, which I just found super funny how they handled this in this game, and it being just so blatantly obvious what was happening, with us hearing him talk in his normal voice to Aerith, yet the only person in the room is Red 13, us being confused over who she was talking to, and all that's just so stupid. Especially when his voice change ends up having like no weight in the narrative moving forward, which through this conversation, we also hear him talk about how they had lost the memories that the Whispers had gave them, which is a major knock against this game as well. Again, this essentially nullifying a lot of what Aerith and Red 13's characters did in Remake, of this intrigue being set up of them having knowledge of the future, yet here it just becomes a moot point. And then we get to Junon itself, which was just ridiculous. The fact that Cloud and Co can just walk around unfettered at first. This is where we finally see Rufus being introduced to the story, where a lot of his scenes then were revolving around his dynamic with Glenn, who is a character from Ever Crisis that appeared here, and even his role in the story here was just perplexing to me, and the fact that they changed him into being the leader of Wutai and very clearly gave him connections to Sephiroth right away. While even here, again, I think there were interesting things to do with Glenn's character, even those end up feeling a bit underwhelming to me by the end. But obviously a lot of the Junon sections are playing as expected, where we have Cloud going undercover and leading the march at the parade, which is all this like really wacky moment, though again it is part of the OG. Though we do also get this like ridiculous moment of Yuffie trying to assassinate Rufus, only for Barrett to stop her for some reason. Again, Barrett, someone that is trying at all costs to stop Shinra, ends up stopping someone from assassinating the Shinra president, which is stupid. After this, we get this like weird section of us playing solely as Cloud, as he himself is trying to escape, and we get this boss battle against Roach, who is back because obviously all that was very strange. Though like the OG game, it leads to them sneaking onto a ship, which was strangely changed from a cargo ship to a cruise ship, which to be fair, I don't actually mind that change. But it does take us to chapter 5, taking place entirely on the ship, where obviously start the chapter off, we get a Queen's Blood tournament, which was strange. Now, technically, you don't have to actually finish the Queen's Blood tournament, but again, just really strange that this was added to the main campaign here. Though it does lead to some humorous Red moments of him being insulted at how he can't enter the tournament because he's not human, and obviously it leads up to the moment of him being in the Shinra armor, pretending to be a person at the end, and that ends up being the final fight of this tournament, which is bizarre. But it is funny how after this Queen's Blood tournament, the rest of it plays out pretty similar to the OG, where we do get this boss battle against Genova. And we obviously get more ominous Sephiroth talk, to where I actually did think at this point in the story something was finally going to happen, but no. But we get to chapter 6 at Costa del Sol, which ends up being a bizarre chapter. And the fact that a lot of this ends up being superfluous content. It's a lot of content around the entire crew doing these random mini games and seemingly having a vacation, despite there still being the Sephiroth threat going on. Or really, I feel like that's a major issue of this game, is this sense of urgency. It really feels like there is no sense of urgency until there's just random points of the story where they just randomly add urgency to the story. But again, a lot of this ends up being pretty superfluous. So us being able to like play Queen's Blood and have the shooting game as Cloud, only for us to then transition to Tifa and Aerith, because that's something we needed to do. Or they have even more things to do in Costa del Sol, from returning wheelies to finding the hidden cactars to playing this weird soccer mini game as Red, or having Tifa play Tifa's theme on the piano. And just all this was so weird of why is this in the main story. And it all leads up to the characters gathering together on the beach, which ends up being an interesting scene, all leading up to a confrontation with Hojo, where we do get this ridiculous moment of Cloud picking up an umbrella as a sword, which is obviously a very clear reference to Crisis Core. And initially this made me think, oh, like Cloud must be Zack. This must be Zack reliving Cloud's memories or something to that nature. That must be what they're doing here. But no, this is just a reference for reference sake. Anyway, the chapter does end with Yuffie joining the crew in a position where you can just tell her not to join and she'll join anyway, which was pointless. Then gets to chapter 7, which is Mount Corral, which ends up being another bloated, boring section like chapter 3 of us having to navigate the area with one grouping, only for us to then transition to the other grouping with us getting this really long Yuffie section of her having to grapple hook her way through the area, which was monotonous. And it all ends with this like cart ride where Barrett has to shoot down things along the way, adding another mini game to the game. Just feeling again, this game just adds so much to its runtime, despite none of this being actually necessary for the main narrative. But anyway, we then arrive at Corel Village, where we do get the start of Barrett's backstory, something that, again, for me just did not feel nearly as impactful as the OG game. I do feel like just the way it was told here was just really over the top, and us seeing like literally every single person talking shit about him as he walks through the town, and the resolution that we end up seeing in chapter 8 and ends up being extremely anticlimactic as well. So I feel like that's again just another fundamental issue of this game, where it kind of reminds me of my issues of God of War Ragnarok, and the fact that there are portions of this game that are so dragged out, where it feels like nothing is happening at the important moments for the story, these moments that should have been the primary focus of the story. It feels like they just rush through those. They don't have as much gravitas to them, which, to be fair, I think a lot of that is because, again, they're trying to retell the events of Final Fantasy VII, while also having this compilation content being added to it that ends up putting less focus onto these big moments that makes them come off more underwhelming. But with that, we get to chapter 8, which ends up being our first visit to the Gold Saucer, where we get this like ridiculously over-the-top intro with this dance sequence that was just so surreal to see. With that comes a billion mini games that we're forced to play, because obviously. But through this, we obviously get introduced to Cait Sith, who I will say I actually kind of liked as a character in this game, which surprised me, because I did not like Cait Sith in the original game. I felt like he was just a bizarre character there. Yeah, I actually feel like he mostly came off as endearing through through this game, much more so than many of the other characters that were introduced through this game. Where actually, surprisingly, I think Cait Sith might be one of the best handled characters in Rebirth here, which to first not really saying much. Again, like in the OG game, we do have a guy with a gun in his arm killing people at the Gold Saucer, which in this game, they make it very clear it's not Barrett, which is such a questionable choice. Taking out that intrigue there. Well, this leads to us going to Corral Prison, where, as you would want for Final Fantasy VII, we get this very long sequence of having to feed a chocobo. So we can do the chocobo race before we find Barrett. So again, like, we're supposed to be caring about where Barrett is and what's going on with him, all while we're doing these monotonous mini games to get food for a chocobo, with this just, again, being so surreal. It's like, how is this Final Fantasy VII? It blows my mind that people like this game when we're spending over an hour doing these monotonous tasks here in the middle of these grander moments in the game, which again is kind of just a major issue with this game in general. But again, we find Barrett, where we get the boss battle between Barrett and Dyne, which again did not have as much of an impact to me. With them also changing Dyne's motivations and it feeling like they tried to not make him as far gone as he was in the original, which was strange to me. And the boss battle itself is also ridiculous, where we have him sprouting out these like mechanical arms and everything, which was so weird. And again, his death scene ended up having like no real impact to me, where immediately after he dies, we proceed to get more boss battles. Where it really just feels like this game doesn't know how to breathe. It just feels like this game just continuously throws stuff at the wall, really sapping any emotional weight from any of this game's big moments, as we'll talk about. And again, we follow that with another Barrett section of him at the back of the truck shooting things down, which was ridiculous that he's doing this immediately after Dyne's death. But it takes us to chapter 9, where we have the buggy, which we only have for this very short section that simply just seems like it's there for the sake of it being a thing in Final Fantasy VII. This ends up taking us to Gongaga, where we meet Cissnei, who's a character from Crisis Core that obviously they need to add to the main story here. But this does lead to some interesting moments of us meeting Zack's parents, and again, them just openly talking about Zack now, where like for some reason, Cloud can just hear Zack's name and not be affected by it, which is not really explained. But anyway, we do have to head to the reactor, where we found that there are whispers surrounding it in typical Final Fantasy Rebirth fashion. We first go with Cloud, Barrett, and Red, only for us to then proceed to have to do the section again as Tifa, Aerith, and Yuffie, both leading to their own separate massive boss battles, but ends up leading to a really bizarre section of the game here as well, and that we do see Cloud almost killing Tifa and her falling into the life stream, with us getting the Tifa life stream moment here, which is bizarre. Or again, this is a moment that happens towards the end of the game. This is supposed to be this big moment for the Cloud-Tifa relationship and us being revealed to everything that happened to Cloud and what's really going on in the story. But they just do it here and not even fully go through it, but just for some reason decide to tell you many of those plot threads, which is such a questionable choice to me. And along with that, we also get introduced to the White Whispers as well, which, to be fair, I kind of expected was going to be a thing coming into this game. That again, Sephiroth controlled the Black Whispers, while Aerith / the planet controls the White Whispers. Again, I think that makes sense. But it is funny how following this, we just continue on, where again, despite Cloud almost killing Tifa, the group just continues on as if nothing happens, which is ridiculous. But here we now see that the plan is to go to Cosmo Canyon, where here we have to get a plane to go there, which is where we get introduced to Cid, who doesn't feel like Cid, really feels nothing like Cid. And to be fair, I mean, certain aspects of Cid's character has not aged well, and like I can understand on a fundamental level of why they would want to change that, but he just feels nothing like the character from the OG. He actually feels like this nice guy that just wants to fly us around at points, and he doesn't do anything in this game either outside of just flying us around. Well, obviously, I'm assuming they're saving his development for part 3, where I assume Rocket Town's going to be in that game, but why is he even here at all when he doesn't do anything? This leads to chapter 10. We get the Cosmo Canyon, where right away, Red changes his voice. Just because, I guess. Where again, like, I understand the overall concept of Red trying to pretend like he's older, and doing this fake voice until he gets to Cosmo Canyon, yet he just changes it at Cosmo Canyon, doesn't even explain really why outside of this offhand comment about how he wanted to be respected, but doesn't explain why he changes it now. Really, just in general, Red 13 is such a bizarre character to me in the remake trilogy, where again, initially he was a radically different character from the OG, where he had this extra knowledge from what Aerith gave him in remake. I didn't mind them changing his character there, but for them to then retract that in this game and change him back to the character that he was in the OG game, despite him also still having this knowledge at points, was just bizarre. Like, none of this is handled properly here. We also get this like weird campfire scene of Aerith giving this like big speech that was clearly the setup for her to eventually die in this game, which also felt out of place. And what do you know, we follow that up with this massive trial for Red, where we get this very lengthy section of us playing as Red, which again in the OG is supposed to be this big moment for Red's character, yet here I just simply did not feel like it had the impact that it should have, especially considering immediately following this we then get contacted by the Gi tribe, and we get this weird section of us fighting against the Gi tribe and going to their village and learning about the black materia, which was all so superfluous and didn't need to be there, especially considering this all leads up to the Gi telling Cloud to get the black materia for them, only for Cloud to say no. So what was the point? But then we get to chapter 11, which ends up being the Nibelheim chapter, where I will say something that is a bit different about this game to the OG is the fact they do add in this more narrative context for why you're going to these places, where in the original you were kind of stumbling onto these places, while here we're going to Nibelheim to find a terminal, to find out the location of the Temple of the Ancients, which, again, I don't actually mind this added context of why we're going to these places, though I do feel like this explanation felt very flimsy, and just in general, the overall Nibelheim section here was just bizarre to me. Again, it feeling like they stripped away part of what made that section good, where again, originally in that game, you go to Nibelheim and are surprised at the fact that it's rebuilt, and you're confused over what's really happening there, only for it to eventually be revealed that Shinra rebuilt the city and that everyone there is a Shinra employee. Yet here, it's just blatantly told to you right away, and that this is supposed to be this clinic for Mako poisoning, and that again just strips away a lot of the impact of the chapter there. Also beyond that, we get this like bizarre scene between Aerith and Cloud on the water tower, which just felt wrong. Again, it kind of feeling like this game ends up putting a lot more credence to the Cloud and Aerith relationship than the Cloud and Tifa relationship, which was bizarre to me. But then we get the typical trope of us having to go to the reactor to get an ID card, and the group being separated because obviously. But this probably leads to my least favorite section in the entire game, which is this extremely lengthy section of playing as Cait Sith, which is a very clear reference to Dirge of Cerberus, and was just so annoying to play, where you're just playing as Cait Sith, where, I mean, outside of Aerith, it's probably my least favorite character to play as, but we have this like lengthy section of him having to carry around boxes and throw boxes at switches, and having all these like fights on his own, and even when he's not on his own, he's with Barrett and Aerith, who are two of the other not as great characters, and again, just an outright annoying section to play here. But following that, we then regroup with Cloud to where we finally meet Vincent, who is fine in this game. Again, he doesn't really do much, he's simply just there, but it does lead to a boss battle against Vincent, which I actually did like there. I mean, I do feel like Vincent is not handled terribly of the new characters here. He just simply doesn't really do that much. But in typical Rebirth fashion, we follow that up with another boss battle right afterwards with Roach, who turns into a black cloak following that. But this leads to chapter 12, where Cait Sith convinces us to go back to the Gold Saucer because we need to blow out the game. I'm too fair, this was in the original, but a lot of this ends up being super superfluous. Well, it is here where we get the dates, where obviously a lot of the previous interactions in the game and certain side quests can determine who you go on the date with, where because I didn't do any of the side quests and did have some pretty poor dialogue options, I ended up getting Cait Sith, which is the worst option. But straight up, I've watched the other scenes online, and I do think the Tifa and Yuffie scenes are both pretty solid as well, though I felt like the Aerith scene was just kind of bizarre and how forward she was being. But anyway, it is here that we do get to watch Loveless and be part of the play, which was all very strange. Again, the play sequence was in the original game, but it wasn't Loveless, but of course they need to add Loveless to this game. And this is where we also have Aerith eventually singing the song at the end, because also obviously, which again, with this song, No Promises to Keep, it made it very clear Aerith had to die in this game. I don't know what this game would have been if Aerith didn't die. But following the date here, we obviously have to get more boss battles. Because for some reason, Don Corneo's back in the story, and we have to fight off against him, followed up by a fight against the Turks, followed up by a fight against Rufus. For some reason, again, why is any of this here? It's just so pointless. Following that, we have Kaseth finally betraying the group, because obviously, we get the chapter 13, which ends up being the Temple of the Ancients, which ends up being really bloated, somehow turning what is less than an hour section of the OG game into a 6-hour dungeon, which was mind-blowing to me. How much they could bloat off this section, where it just goes on and on and on. I mean, we get these puzzles where you have to shift gravity, and following that, we also have the group being split off to where Cloud ends up leading his own group, while Aerith ends up being separated and ends up having these like life stream puzzles of you having to find life stream to absorb and use that to open up pathways, which was weird. And we then get back to Cloud and have a boss battle against the Turks and meet up back with Aerith, only for us to then have to go back in time again to play as Aerith's group again. And it's like, what are we doing? And you would think following this, after all these series of boss battles, that would be the end, but no, we then proceed to have trials for each of the characters, feeling like moments that were here simply just to give more backstory to all these characters, all of which felt extremely melodramatic, where we get these ridiculous scenes of us seeing Red being kidnapped and being tortured by Hojo and being given the name Red 13, which felt very over the top. We see Tifa seeing her father's death. We get Barrett seeing his wife's death. We get more of Yuffie and Sonon, only for us to then follow this up by Aerith reliving her mother's death, which again was just so over the top in how it was portrayed here. Again, just feels like we're being shown these moments that don't matter. Like, we did not need to see this. We already knew that these things happen. We didn't need to actually see them for ourselves. And again, it's just here to bloat out the game. After more boss battles, we finally get to the Black Materia, which when grabbing it, the temple starts to crumble and Kaseth arrives to sacrifice himself, which again is portrayed as this like really over the top moment, which is so funny considering he knows that he's not gonna die and that he has another bodies. So why is he being so melodramatic when he's on his own? But anyway, this is where we do have Cloud obviously being manipulated into giving Black Materia to Sephiroth. As in the original game, though, this does lead to this weird sequence of Cloud and Aerith falling into a pit, to where this takes us to the final chapter of the game, where we get this weird dream date between Cloud and Aerith, which is clearly in another timeline, which is where this game completely goes insane at this point. And this clearly just being this like farewell to Aerith, which just felt very out of character for both characters involved here. We do also get more Zack stuff here, where again, like, we're pretty much getting fully revealed to even more timelines, where all these scenes have different dog breeds for Stamp, essentially implying different timelines, where here we have Zack talking about making a choice between saving Aerith, Cloud, and Biggs, and each one of these seeming to create a different timeline, which is insane that we have this much going on. And we do get Sephiroth just doing this massive lore dump at this point, just telling Cloud about all of these different worlds that exist, and now Sephiroth's plan is to merge all of them and control over all of them, which is like, whatever. But again, it's very strange that following this, we then just get back to FF7, where we still get the scene in the forest with Aerith, where she ends up going off, and we have the trek to the Forgotten Capital with our crew, where here we do get to the Aerith death scene, which again felt like what this game was leading up to. It felt like a lot of this game was really just set up to the Aerith death scene, and somehow they really botch it. Here we get the big moment here of Sephiroth going down to kill Aerith, only for us to see Cloud attempt to stop him, and it seemed like it worked at first, only for it to then not. I guess this also being two separate timelines that were created here, one where Aerith lives and one where she dies, and then we still play off the rest of the game as if she did die, where we do get the moment of her materia bouncing on the ground and us mourning her death, only for us to get the Genova fight like we get in the original game. And that in itself, again, for me, I never loved the aspect of the original game that immediately after the Aerith death, you do get the Genova fight following it, but I can still see its purpose there. Where here, okay, you get the Genova fight, and again, that in itself was a grand enough fight with involving all the members of your party, with us having these like individual individual sections, or you have two members of the party going against it at a time, and it felt like that was a satisfying enough final boss for the game, only for it to not be the final boss, where again it just feels ridiculous that the rest of this game is a series of boss battles following this, all happening after the Aerith death, one of the biggest moments in the history of gaming, yet it just seems like it's forgotten because we have to have all these boss battles, leading up to probably the most ridiculous moment of this game, which, to be fair, I was not surprised that this happened at some point in the remake trilogy. I just thought it would happen in part 3, but we do have Zack somehow getting to the edge of creation and meeting Cloud, where we get this team-up fight between Zack and Cloud against Sephiroth, to where together they say the dumb soldier honor phrase from Crisis Core, and all this is just so stupid. Again, it just feels like them putting way too much importance on Zack. It makes no sense. It's just complete nonsense here. Have Zack actually be involved in this story. It's not even properly explain what this even is. Again, they're in the edge of a creation. They're having this boss battle against Sephiroth, only for them to be separated again, leading to another boss battle against Sephiroth Reborn, where we get different phases of this fight, from us playing as Cloud and us having to climb up him and attack him that way, which is funny. And then we get a fight involving the other members of the crew, and then we get a fight with Zack against him. And it's, again, all happening immediately after Aerith death, only for his fight to conclude, leading up to the final boss battle in the game of Cloud taking off Sephiroth again in the Edge of Creation, but now joined by Aerith. Just like, what are we doing? Where this made me genuinely worry that they were actually genuinely bringing Aerith back to life, which, I mean, they kind of do. But again, we get this final boss battle here. We're following it, we do see Aerith come back to life in the proper timeline. We'll then proceed to see the group mourning over Aerith, with Cloud seeming to be the only one that can see Aerith. Making it clear at this point that we're essentially getting Force Ghost Aerith moving forward, which is so dumb. Again, it's like this complete half measure of them wanting to continue to kill off Aerith, but keeping her in the story, which again just goes against the original game. The point of Aerith's death is supposed to be this sudden loss, and it being this big, shocking moment where you're not supposed to see Aerith again following that. But here, I just assume she's going to be making appearances in the game moving forward, and all of it just feels like a complete misunderstanding of Final Fantasy VII. And while, again, I do think there's an interesting concept to be had here of this, again, playing into Cloud's mental health, I just feel like, again, it really just neuters the Aerith death scene. And finally, we get some final scenes of Glenn revealing that he's actually Sephiroth, because obviously, and also having Zack saying that he's gonna unite the worlds again, because obviously. And we end the game on this shot of the group flying away on the tiny Bronco with Aerith watching them. And again, as the credits were rolling for me, I was just genuinely confused at what was going on here, and the fact that this game did not turn out any way that I expected. Again, I very much came into this thinking that while I think the main core of the game will still be a remake of 7, because obviously they're going to do that, I did still feel like the grander narrative would still be the sequel to the OG game. Yet here again, by the end here, they had taken away a lot of what Remake set up. They had gotten rid of Aerith and Red 13's knowledge of the future. They had taken away the intrigue from the Zack timeline, with him clearly not having much to really do in the story at this point outside of fan service. They leave very little of the actual plot threads that were set up in Remake open coming into the third game, which just makes me, again, confused that what are we doing then? Like, it boggles my mind that they did all this setup only for this to just actually be just a remake of the original game, and a worse one at that. Again, just bloating out the narrative to a massive extreme, and somehow making moments from the original game even worse, while also not even committing to the new storyline that was set up before. So for me, again, this just completely recontextualized this entire remake trilogy as nothing but a mess. A terrible remake, and one that is sadly being well received by most people. To where, again, I come out of Rebirth genuinely thinking this is actually a bad game. Like, I think from a pure gameplay perspective, it's not a fun game to play outside of combat. I do feel like many of these games' characters just feel out of character for what they're supposed to be. The plot is completely meandering, with very little happening outside of the beginning and the end, to which even in those moments the narrative just comes off as completely nonsensical, and it just feels like there's no purpose to this anymore. It felt like there was a purpose coming out of Remake, where again, even though I have criticisms of Remake, I think Remake was at least this relatively focused experience. It felt like there was this set agenda they wanted to get across with Remake, yet Rebirth feels like it just undoes all of that, just making this a jumbled mess of a retelling of the original game's story, to where I'm personally not that excited for the third game at this point. I do really feel like this actually just sapped all of my excitement for the third game, to where I'm probably still going to play it, but I actually genuinely don't care about what they do anymore. I think whatever they do is going to be terrible, as they already butchered most of what they had going for the Remake trilogy through this game. Where while I think it's very difficult to be worse than this game, I just don't know what they can do to actually genuinely improve upon the original Final Fantasy VII by remaking it in the way that they're doing, to where, again, I genuinely do not like this game. While I think there are definitely aspects of this game that are at least enjoyable, I mean, there are still decent character moments at points. There are some decent performances. Certain moments that are recreated just like the original game are still good moments in a vacuum, yet this entire game is just this jumbled mess that doesn't fully commit to anything and just came off as a largely disappointing experience, where I genuinely can't even think of the last time I played a game like this and came out of it feeling just empty. Not empty in a good way of being sad that it's gone, but empty and just being so frustrated at what it is. And because of that, for me, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth just ended up being a massive disappointment to me. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on FF7 Rebirth. Now, again, I'll continue to do spoiler reviews for games that I pick up at launch and play right away. Also, beyond that, again, still have retrospectives down the road. At some point, I would actually like to genuinely make a Final Fantasy VII OG video. I think that could be fun. Also, I would like to remake my remake video, considering that remake video was before I even had a full understanding of what Remake was, and it's not even a good video, and I don't stand by a lot of that video, where I would like to redo that as well. I think it'll be funny to talk about Crisis Core at some point, and just, again, obviously just expect more of the same type of videos down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.